summit. He is also due to hold a number of bilateral meetings with presidents and leaders from different countries. In its Saturday edition, New York Times hailed Egypt's hosting of tomorrow's climate summit COP27, saying it comes at a time at which world crises are aggravating, with upheavals in energy markets, increasing inflation, in addition to deep political disputes and intense relations. The climate summit in Sharm el-Sheikh COP27 will be the most updated version of the conference of the parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The convention goes back to 1992, when the Earth Summit was held in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Let's have a closer look.
Representatives from the world's nations begin meetings in Sharm el-Sheikh as of tomorrow to flesh out the rules of a new global climate pact, whilst leaders meet on Monday. Decades of climate talks have made some progress that needs a lot of work to turn words into action. In the 2021 UN Climate Summit COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, the Glasgow Pact was issued and marked the first time a UN climate agreement mentioned the goal of reducing fossil fuel use. The pact marked a breakthrough in efforts to resolve rules guiding the international trade of carbon markets to offset emissions. With the running out for steep emissions cuts, the pact also urges nations to come up with more ambitious climate plans. In 2020, the Kyoto Protocol, the international climate treaty, expired. 5 years prior to this date, exactly in December 2015, Kyoto's successor, the Paris Agreement, was agreed. The key agreement aims to limit the rise in average global surface temperature. To do this, countries that signed the accord set national pledges to reduce humanity's effect on climate that are meant to become more ambitious over time. The Paris Accord legally bound its signatories collectively to limit greenhouse gas emissions to keep temperature rises well below 2 degrees Celsius this century. But the countries also promised to pursue efforts to keep the rise below 1.5 degrees, which scientists say would help to avert some of the most catastrophic effects. Soberingly, the world has already heated up by just over 1 degree since the start of the Industrial Revolution. A UN report said even if all the pledges made so far are delivered, it is still on track for an average rise of 2.7 degrees this century.
In the same context, delegates from nearly 200 countries will gather in Egypt's South Sinai resort of Sharm el-Sheikh November 6th through to November 18th for the UN Climate Summit COP27. It's being billed as the African COP, amid hopes that the first climate summit to be held in Africa will address the fears of the Black continent, which is least responsible for climate change.
As Africa braces to host the UN Climate Change COP27 summit in Egypt as of Sunday, observers hope the summit will meet the continent's urgent needs. A study by the Carbon Brief News Service said last week that in Africa alone, extreme weather events have killed at least 4,000 people and displaced 19 million so far this year. The ongoing drought in East Africa is impacting livelihoods of more than 9 million people, and 1.4 million people have been displaced in recent weeks in the worst floods on record in Nigeria. As the toll of climate-linked disasters mounts in debt-ridden countries across Africa, governments are demanding that rich polluters pay for the harm their emissions have already caused, known as loss and damage. Ugandan campaigner Vanessa Nakati said historically Africa is responsible for less than 4% of global emissions, but Africans are suffering some of the most brutal impacts of the climate crisis. Richer governments rejected a call for a financial mechanism to address losses and damage at last year's climate talks in Glasgow, and instead negotiators agreed to start a dialogue on financial compensation. Glasgow agreed to raise the ambition of their emissions-cutting plans. However, the UN says those additional measures would result in a pollution cut of less than 1% by 2030. The Glasgow summit also produced a new strategy for financing energy transition. A group of rich nations committed to providing $8.5 billion to coal-dependent South Africa, one of the world's largest greenhouse gas emitters, over 3 to 5 years in grants and loans to help its climate plan and catalyze private investment. But the World Bank said this week that South Africa will require at least $500 billion to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050.
All eyes on Egypt while hosting UN Climate Conference COP27, at which 30,000 participants representing 29 countries, including leaders of countries, heads of governments and representatives of international organizations. Stressing Egypt's vital role, and Great stated the Interior Ministry has put a strict strategy to secure such global event and guarantees full security of Sharm el-Sheikh, the city of peace. The strategy starts from the moment of the arrival of the delegations participating in the summit and strict procedures of recognition of the participant identities. Australia will launch a bid with Pacific nations to host the United Nations Climate Summit in 2026 as the new Labour government seeks to position the country as a renewable energy powerhouse on the global stage. The government also reinstated the role of the ambassador for climate change, appointing Kristen Tilley, who it said had over a decade of experience with climate change policy, to work with other countries to tackle the climate crisis. Australia has lagged the developed countries on its climate action, with the former government of Scott Morrison resisting pressure to set more ambitious carbon emission targets at last year's Glasgow Climate Summit. The government has also joined the global methane pledge to reduce global methane emissions by 30%.